In the Bible, there's only one figure who is able to speak to the wind or the waves or the swirling chaos of the sea. There's only one voice that everybody in creation obeys. In the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, as well as the New Testament, it's just God. God is the only one who has the ability to speak to the wind and the waves and make them listen, right? That's actually this recurring thread that comes throughout the whole story of Israel's scriptures, what we sometimes call the Old Testament or the Hebrew scriptures. It's God who's continually the one speaking to the powers of nature that are beyond human control. It's there in the storytelling in Genesis 1, right, where as God is making the universe by speech, right, calling the universe into existence. God speaks to the waters and they're parted. The sky and the sea are formed. God speaks to the wind and it moves and rustles things. And then throughout the Psalms and the wisdom literature in the Hebrew Bible, you get this recurring refrain. Who has the power to speak to the wind and the waves? God does. Only God does. God tells the oceans where their limits are and not to go any further. God tells the wind to roar and to blow and to cause things to come to life over and over and over again in the Bible. The only one who has the ability to speak to creation and it obeys and it listens is God, who from the very beginning is calling things into existence, and by the sheer creative power of God's voice, things come into existence when God says so. From the roar of the wind and the waves to the stillness of the air to every creature in all the world, right? Over and over and over again, God is named as the one who has power because God has the creative authority to make the wind and the waves as well as the rest of creation obey God. And so that's all in the background when the story comes this coming Sunday that we're going to hear in Mark's Gospel. Jesus happens to be on a boat with his disciples, and ordinary human Jesus gets tired. He falls asleep in the back of the boat, and then that's when the storm starts to brew and the wind and the water starts churning, and the rest of Jesus' disciples, many of them who are professional fishermen, right, who don't need to be afraid at things like this, but they're afraid. They start waking up Jesus. Jesus, aren't you afraid? Don't you care that we're drowning? Don't you care that we're going to die here? And Jesus' response, he gets up and he speaks to the wind and the waves. He says, "Peace, be still." And the way Mark tells it, the wind dies down, the waves calm down, and they get to their destination safely and in peace. And the disciples are left scratching their heads, asking the question Mark has been finding every way he can think of to give us the answer to. The rest of the disciples all say, "Who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him?" Of course, Mark, the storyteller, is like, duh, I've been trying to tell you, I've been trying to show you like a good storyteller does, showing rather than just telling. Jesus is the one in whom God is present. Jesus' kind of authority is God's kind of authority. And just like God's authority, Jesus has the ability then to speak to the wind and the waves, to put creation back in order, to restore order in the midst of chaos, to bring peace in the midst of troubled times. The reason to listen to Jesus, Mark is convinced, isn't just that he's a persuasive, interesting rabbi with some occasional helpful life principle insights, but that Jesus is the one in whom God's creative voice, God's authoritative voice speaks. That what Jesus says, that's what God says. What Jesus is like, God is like. That's the recurring information, the recurring lesson, the idea that Mark really wants to get across to us. Not just that, hey, if you're in a rough patch, maybe Jesus will give you a miracle and give you smooth sailing, but rather the reason to listen to Jesus is he actually knows what he's talking about. He actually really is God's presence among us. And that God, therefore, is willing to get into the boat, into the dangerous place, into the troubled waters with us. The thing that I love about this story is that it doesn't imagine that what we need is Jesus to be like our Lucky Charm or Rabbit's Foot, to appeal to a God who's somewhere else, watching all of the terrible things in life happen, but that Jesus brings God into the boat with us, right beside us, and from there speaks that authoritative word like God always has from the creation of the universe on, speaking to the universe, and it comes into being. If you ask Mark, why is a story like this important? It's not just Jesus could do cool stuff, But here's one more reason that it's worth putting our trust in Jesus. Here's one more reason why Jesus' voice is worth listening to, even when he surprises us, even when he says startling things like God's kingdom doesn't come like a marching army, but like, like we talked about last week, like the surprising growth of a weed in a field. Or that when Jesus says his way of bringing God's kingdom, God's reign into the world is suffering love that goes to a cross, not conquering and destroying his enemies. That Jesus says things that surprise us, that don't seem like conventional wisdom. Why would we listen to Jesus? Well, it turns out he's the one who really embodies God's creative power as he has all along. This coming Sunday, we're going to explore just what it means that Jesus' voice is authoritative and whether we'll take Jesus' voice seriously. And similarly, that if Jesus' voice has the authority to tell the wind and the waves to calm down and they obey, can we dare to trust when Jesus calls you and me his people? When he calls a child, you belong and you are beloved in the waters of baptism. When Jesus says to us, I will be with you, can we dare to trust his voice then? Mark's been telling us all along, of course. If you can believe, if you can dare to trust, this same Jesus is the one who calms the wind and the waves, speaking God's authoritative voice, then yeah, we can trust when Jesus says to you or to me, you are beloved. Join us for that conversation this coming Sunday. See you then.